Now, in this week's From Beginning to Endgame, we're going to be taking a relatively quick look at the journey of Thor in the MCU, and following his highs and lows, not to mention his rather unique character development through all 6 movies he's been in thus far, before finishing up with just a little bit of speculation about what his role in Endgame might be like. And jumping right into it, we of course first meet Thor in his self-titled movie called, well, just Thor. And right away we're introduced to a character type that we feel like maybe we've seen before in other films, or even have had experience with in our own lives. Because he's almost like that lovable jock from pretty much every high school movie you've ever seen, or maybe even from your own high school experience. The one who's naturally and effortlessly good at any and every physical activity they partake in. And despite being rather arrogant, conceited, immature, stubborn, and overflowing with self-confidence, all things that you would think would make them hated, there's just something about them that draws you in and makes you like them. Something good or maybe even honorable at their core that radiates out and blinds you to everything you'd normally dislike about them. And if they could just find a way to embrace whatever that goodness is within them and be a little less hot-headed and gain some degree of humility, they could become something truly special. And that, in a nutshell, is the story of Thor in his first movie. Because he starts out as all those things I just mentioned, yet still seems loved and adored by the people of Asgard anyway. He's also clearly respected, trusted, and admired by those he calls friends, those who would, and do, like Lady Sif and the Warriors 3, follow him into the depths of an icy hell on a whim, or will risk everything to try and bring him back after he's been exiled. But as much as he's loved and adored by pretty much everyone, it's his family, mainly his brother Loki and his father Odin, who see the real Thor, who see past that winning smile and all those heroic deeds he's accomplished, and realize he's not all he could be, or should be, or really needs to be in order to sit on the throne and rule the 9 realms. And both will challenge Thor in this movie, though for different reasons, and in different ways, while also hoping to get vastly different results out of him. Because Odin, his father and current king, wants someone just and wise to take his place, someone who will not be a tyrant and warmonger, much like he was at times, and who will lead the 9 realms to ruin. And very early in the movie, Thor is about to be crowned king, while Odin just looks resigned to the fact that this is how it has to be, that Thor will have to, hopefully, learn as he goes and grow into the king Asgard needs. But that aforementioned intrusion by frost giants, orchestrated by Loki, who thinks he should be king, puts an end to the proceedings. And again, when Thor is ready to start a war over the unsuccessful actions of just a few frost giants, and after being goaded by Loki into striking back, he almost does start a war, but he ultimately gets his power taken away and is banished to Earth by Odin, which of course Loki thinks and hopes will be about the last he'll ever see of his brother, while Odin hopes this experience might finally begin to show Thor what his reckless nature can lead to. At first though, while on Earth, Thor's not interested or doesn't understand that he's being tested by his father. In fact, he doesn't really figure that out until he eventually passes said test, because he starts out by treating the people he meets on Earth like a means to an end. He doesn't see them as people with lives of their own, but only as someone or something who can either help him get his hammer back or they're just in the way. Now, that's not to say he's particularly rude or disrespectful to them, because he's not, but he's yet to understand that because of who he is, or should I say what he is, his actions can ultimately have a great impact on the lives of everyone and anyone in the 9 realms he's supposed to be protecting or serving. And it's only after he finds his hammer again and fails to be able to lift it since he's no longer worthy of it, and is then told by Loki that their father is dead and that he'll never be allowed back into Asgard, that he begins to finally question who and what he really is or wants to be, and starts to ponder where he went so wrong. He even tells Erik Selvig while out drinking that he wished he'd listened to his father's lessons. And so, with everything taken away from him and having to figure out what to do with his life now, Thor begins to bond and truly care about the people of Earth. And when Lady Sif and the Warriors 3 show up to bring him home after telling him the truth about his father, Loki sends the Destroyer after them. And this is when Thor finally begins to realize the destruction the gods and their squabbling and or battles can bring upon the common folk of the 9 realms, and the destruction he would have brought about as the warmongering king he was set to be. And so Thor pleads with Loki to take his life and to spare the people, finally learning the burden that comes with ruling, that a true king or leader puts the needs of his people above all else, and doesn't seek war, but instead saves it as a last resort, that he actually exists to serve and protect them, not to just be loved and adored by them as he serves his own needs. And having learned this, Thor is finally truly worthy of wielding Mjolnir, and ready to become the protector of Earth and one of the Avengers. And that then takes us right into that movie, The Avengers, where Loki, who is thought dead, is now seeking to rule the people of his brother's new favorite planet in a way to get back at him. And this, of course, infuriates Thor, who's been sent to bring him back to Asgard. And when he first encounters his brother again, we see Thor go from absolute rage to just sadness and bitterness, because he truly missed his brother and mourned his death, despite all Loki did or tried to do to him. And this is when we begin to understand that Thor's greatest flaw or weakness is that he loves his brother and wants to believe in him, and that he longs for the days of their youth when they played and then fought side by side, when he thought his brother would always be there with him. But of course, Loki always thought he was just living in Thor's shadow. And before Thor can finish his talk with Loki and learn the whereabouts of the Tesseract before bringing them both home, the other soon-to-be Avengers, who initially captured Loki, show up to take him back, and a fight ensues between Thor and Iron Man before ultimately being ended by the more level-headed Captain America. And it's here, not to mention also in his later fight with the Hulk, that perhaps Thor begins to realize that not all humans are weak and in need of protection, but that some are strong, courageous, and should be respected, and even in the case of Captain America, followed into battle, which is primarily what Thor learns in this movie, to be a member of this team for the greater good of the world he loves. But before we even get to that in this movie, and while on the helicarriers during the middle act of this film, we have the growth of Thor from his first movie reiterated, as he talks about how Asgardians think they're more advanced than the people of Earth, but that they're actually more like Bildschneip, or large scaly creatures that just trample everything in their path. And so once again in this movie, Thor gets to see just what kind of damage his people, or the gods, can inflict upon the common folk. And in the end, of course, the Avengers do ultimately stop Loki, and Thor is allowed to take both the Tesseract and Loki back to Asgard for safekeeping, which then takes us into his next movie, and one of the more maligned movies in the MCU, that of course being Thor: The Dark World, where Jane Foster seems to be partially doing research and partially looking for Thor, who hasn't returned to Earth since the events of the Avengers movie, and is instead trying to bring peace back to the Nine Realms. In other words, we're getting a look at a far more responsible Thor, who puts his responsibility ahead of his personal desires, and seems to have once and for all won the approval of his father, who seems ready to make him king with some confidence. However, during her research, Jane accidentally comes upon the Ether, which is actually the Reality Stone, and becomes possessed by it, which then both awakens the Dark Elf Malekith, who seeks to use it to bring darkness to the whole galaxy, and it also temporarily obscures the vision of Heimdall, who then tells Thor, who then promptly goes after her. And though Malekith is maybe not the best villain in the history of the MCU, and the story itself is lacking and rather very serious in nature, and not anywhere near as fun as the first movie, outside of a few moments of levity usually offered by Erik Selvig, we do get an even closer look at Asgard here, which will be destroyed soon enough, as well as get a couple interesting dynamics between the now very kingly Thor and his father and brother. Because though early in this movie it's clear Thor's interested in impressing and earning the approval of his father even further, soon enough he finds himself at odds with him over what should be done with the possessed Jane Foster, and he turns to his brother Loki for help. And there's this great moment in the movie, perhaps the best of the film, where we see Loki's reaction to hearing the news about the death of Freya, his adoptive mother, and also the one who taught him magic. And then when convincing Thor later to trust him, Loki says to trust his rage, which of course Thor knows has no bounds and has always strongly motivated him. The two then have a brief adventure together as they seek to remove and destroy the ether possessing Jane, before Loki once again supposedly dies, but this time by giving his life to save Thor. And it's this stretch of the film that basically turns out to be the best part of it, because even though both Loki and Thor are great characters on their own, they're even better when they're together. Anyway, in the end, of course, Thor defeats Malekith, and Odin, who's actually Loki in disguise at this point, offers him the throne of Asgard. But Thor turns it down because he realizes he can do more good if he doesn't sit upon it, and doesn't have that huge burden of responsibility upon him, and is instead free to help out where and when needed, which is what he does in Avengers Age of Ultron. He helps out a little bit. And that's pretty much the only thing there is to really say about Thor in this movie. In fact, he disappears for most of it, and his arc is pretty much non-existent, though there were many scenes of his that were deleted from the final cut. Nevertheless, as you know, The Avengers defeat Ultron in the end, and Thor was certainly there for the final battle, I think. And now we come to it at last, Thor Ragnarok. And even though I could easily do an entire video on just this movie, I'm going to keep this very short and just start out by saying that even though yes, I do like and enjoy this movie quite a bit, I don't really like what it did to the character of Thor that I know from the comics and even from the previous movies in the MCU. On many levels, it's a regression of his character, yet I did like this different version of Thor, if that makes any sense and doesn't sound like a total contradiction, because the way the character is played here really allows Chris Hemsworth to use all that charm and charisma that he has to make for a fun, enjoyable character. This was very much a fun and funny movie, right there on par with both Guardians of the Galaxy films, and a stark contrast to Thor the Dark World, which I think it's pretty safe to say is why the change in direction with Thor's character came about, because a lot of people just didn't like that movie, even though I personally felt it was extremely true to the character. And not to get way off topic here, but give Marvel Studios credit for taking fan feedback to heart and giving people the Thor and a movie that they wanted and ultimately enjoyed. Because basically what they did here in this movie is pair Thor up with Loki and Hulk, arguably the two characters he's had by far the best chemistry with on screen. And yeah, that does include Jane Foster, who gets mentioned but is no longer in the picture. Though it's interesting to note that Lady Sif is also not in the picture, though unlike many other Asgardians in this movie, she isn't killed off but rather is completely absent and we have no idea where she is. And speaking of killing off Asgardians, Thor's friends, the Warriors 3, along with many others, all die at the hands of Hela, Thor's sister that he never knew about and was imprisoned by Odin long ago. And upon first meeting her, she crushes his hammer and Thor essentially gets lost in space, only to reunite with, as I mentioned before, Loki and Hulk to have a fun little adventure. However, that doesn't mean this movie is completely empty of character arcs or progression. Yes, as I mentioned before, it in many ways starts off by regressing or resetting the character of Thor, but the idea here is for Thor to learn who or what he truly is, that he's more than just the hammer he wields, that he is indeed the god of thunder, and that really he doesn't even need a hammer, and that maybe it's only there to help him focus all the power that is already inside of him. Also in this movie, Thor seems to finally accept who and what his brother Loki truly is, and he even manages to anticipate the impending betrayal and ends up getting the best of him in the end. Thor also tells Loki that he used to think the world of him, and that he wanted to fight side by side with him forever. And this is truly a great moment for both of these characters, as Thor finally learns he has to let go of Loki and this belief in him, and Loki loses that one person he thought would always have at least some shred of faith in him, which seems to, perhaps, turn Loki's heart a bit, and sets up what he'll do in Avengers Infinity War, where he's finally killed, for real this time I think, after turning on Thanos. And of course Thor gets to witness this, as he also gets to witness the death of his best friend Heimdall, and then vows to kill Thanos for it. But to do that, he's going to need a new hammer or axe, even though the last movie was all about him not needing a weapon. However, the idea here is more or less not that Thor needs a weapon to be Thor, but that he needs a weapon to simply kill Thanos. It's just a tool or a means to an end, I guess. Or at least that's the way I try to look at it here. Because in Infinity War, we see that the hammerless or axeless Thor can take the full brunt of a star. So in other words, yes, he still is very powerful without a weapon, he just needs it to land the death blow on Thanos, who wields the Infinity Stones. And he almost does land that killing blow with it, or could have I should say, because Thor didn't miss the head, which in theory would have killed Thanos instantly, but he instead intentionally hit him in the chest because he wanted Thanos to know he'd gotten his revenge, that he'd kept his promise to kill him. And it's sadly ironic that vengeance, which had been one of Loki's greatest weaknesses, was now the downfall of Thor because he wanted vengeance for Loki. There's even a great scene between Thor and Rocket where he talks about everyone and everything he's lost, and that all he's got left to fuel him now is rage and vengeance, which is likely exactly how Loki felt all along. Which then brings us to Thor's role in Endgame and beyond, and I think it's pretty safe to say that Thor will of course play a big part in their ultimate victory. He may even get a second chance at that killing blow. I also don't think there's any chance he'll be among the casualties that the Avengers will almost certainly take in this movie. Instead, at the end of this movie, I think Thor will go off to try and regroup with what's left of his people, and to be their king and to lead them into the future. And it's hard to know when or even if we'll ever see this character again in the MCU. Well, that's all I've got for this time, and if you haven't already, please feel free to check out my other two beginning to endgame videos featuring Captain America and Iron Man, or to tell me what you thought about this video. Either way, leave a comment below and let's talk some Marvel. And until next time, thanks for watching.